Hello, my name is Samuel Martin, and I am a graduate student at the Kaiser University Criminal Justice Master's Program. And today I will be showing you a presentation about how to better identify and work with secondary sources with problem behaviors in children. To begin, here is a short and brief introduction, a little bit behind the survey you took and the desired outcome for this survey. To begin with, the behavioral science field has expanded in the last 20 years. The psychology field as a whole is a rather young field in the area of science. And since the 1950s, it has grown and grown, and it has been taken a lot more seriously in the educational world. And amongst that, the behavioral sciences has really taken off in the last 20 years, and it's this belief that behaviors can predict future outcomes or behaviors that are seen in the future. Psychologists are able to predict aggressive behaviors as early as 6 years old. Some of these early behaviors are seen in psychopathy and can predict later violent tendencies or violent behaviors in children later in life. Crime and criminal behavior is linked heavily with where and who a child grows up and around. As we'll see later on in this presentation, there is a strong connection between who, what, and where a child is developed in between the ages of 4 to about 16 years old. Our next topic of discussion will be predictive behavior in youth. There has been several studies done that have proven delinquent behavior can be predicted. This will be expounded later on in the literature review, but the big progress in behavioral science and psychology as a whole has been able to not only predict whether or not a child will partake in criminal behavior or choose a criminal lifestyle later in life, but there has been studies that have been able to directly link certain behaviors to certain crimes committed later in life, such as drug abuse or domestic abuse or physical and sexual abuse of children. Some behaviors are general while others can be exact. This again speaks about how if a child lives a life that seems without decision or without thinking later in life, they're more than likely to partake in drug use. Unlike many misconceptions, they are not as prevalent as many think. There's actually about 5 to 7 behaviors that are directly linked with criminal behavior later in life. So just because a child is hyperactive or is considered to be, quote, naughty, unquote, does not necessarily mean that later in life they are going to partake in criminal behavior. Next, we will take a look at the 7 most alarming behaviors that are seen between the ages of 6 and 13 years old in children. Aggression towards peers and teachers. For many, this is somewhat of an obvious behavior seen. Aggression is something that typically tends to stay with children as they grow older. Once in a while, here and there, a slip up from a child is normal and a way that children learn right from wrong. But the constant aggression, constant use of their hands and their feet and their body to communicate their emotions is something that should be paid attention to and may be a giveaway of future criminal behavior. Defiance towards authority. For a student that just cannot follow directions, will not listen, will intentionally do the opposite of what an authority figure tells them, this is something that is within studies that can be found to follow them into their adult years. Hoarding. Hoarding is very, very important to pay attention to because it is linked to neglect and abuse. The act of hoarding itself is not so much linked to criminal behavior, but rather why the hoarding occurs, and that can be come from the abuse, not being given the right amount of food or uh, clothing or those kind of things. And later on in life, this tends to pass on. A child uh, who has been abused is much more likely than other children to commit abuse when they're older. Unwillingness to share. This again goes with the hoarding comment. Uh, for a child to not simply want to pass uh, a colored pencil set, or is constantly having to be told to take less or to give more back, is another sign of abuse and might lead to criminal behavior later in life. Far too mature sexuality. Uh, this is seen many times in abuse awareness studies and excuse me, um, training in educational staff members. This again is a dead giveaway of sexual abuse in a child and should be reported to secondary sources so that the child may receive help, and later in life this is not something they struggle with and may commit themselves. And failure to follow social norms. This is something as easy as not conforming to the rules of school. So constantly getting up from their seats, constantly not raising their hands, um, not getting in line. These small things can be a dead giveaway to later criminal behavior in life. And yes, children do these things and can sometimes struggle with them, but it's the chronic ones. It's the ones that do it over and over and over again and never learn that have the biggest problems and tend to show criminal behavior later. Next comes a short review of the literature of where this data was found. Childhood behavior and adult criminality, cluster analysis, and a prospective study of African Americans. Um, this data is where a large amount of the data used in this survey and project came from. This specifically looked at the abuse factor, the aggression factor, the defiance to authority factor. Um, Moving forward, the childhood behavior problems predict crime and violence in late adolescence, Brazilian and British birth cohort studies. This study was again used to look at specific behaviors that would later in life tie in with uh, criminal behavior. Again, using the examples of aggression, abusive past, and a unwillingness to work with others or the defiance of social norms. Finally, the unsafe at any age, linking childhood and adolescence maltreatment to delinquency and crime. This piece of literature was really the strongest part of evidence and backing of all the reports about abuse and how a child who is abused is more likely than others to commit abuse when they get older. The next slide takes us into a very important slide that might not be known by those outside the psychology or criminal justice world. This is what the behaviors lead to. Uh, Aggressive and violent behaviors. These again can be linked to the aggressive behavior seen in children, the abusive behavior, the defiance of um, social norms and listening to authority figures, and what's unique about these behaviors and the last two is it's more of a frustration instead of a way of they just learn to deal with their emotions. Is they don't feel part of the social norms. They can't conform to listening to authority, so they get frustrated and act out in a way where they're aggressive to other people. Future abuse of substances. This leads back to the impulsivity that we mentioned. That if a child doesn't really think through their decisions ever and just acts and does what immediately gratifies them, more than likely in life they'll continue those behaviors with drug abuse. The impulsivity slash bad decision making or reckless behavior. Um, all of these fall underneath the umbrella of making bad decisions, not thinking clearly, not thinking things through. Um, when these behaviors are seen at such a young age, it's more than likely that they'll continue the thought process that brings them to these behaviors as children as when they get older. Moving forward from the statistics portion of this project, we move to the importance of this study and why it needs to be done and brought up. With staff members spending a large portion of time with students, they can be the greatest surveyors. Teachers spend about 9 months, 8 hours every day with their students, so there's no better person seeing how these children act and how they behave and how they're developing in the world. So, the easiest way and quickest way to help prevent crime is through teachers. If staff members are better educated on the subject, a criminal lifestyle for many can be reduced. If teachers can spot these behaviors and alert secondary sources or find ways to help out students before things get too bad, it not only helps that student and prevents them from going down a criminal path, but it helps the neighborhood and the community as well. It takes a village to raise a child. I use this quote for the mere fact that preventing crime and creating a safer neighborhood doesn't just lie with the police or criminal justice officials. It takes everybody to notice, to react, and to prevent to try and help this world be a better place. The next important question to ask as individuals are what steps should we be taking? The first is to make a concerted effort to identify behaviors. Now that we have been equipped and taught these certain behaviors, it's important to keep eye of these, to write things down, to notice them, to write when a child acts a certain way using one of these behaviors. Stop and note the alarming behaviors. Many times, journals is a good way of doing this, keeping track of a student's behavior when you notice that it's chronic or it's happening over and over and over again. And then finally, reach out to counselors and administration. It's really, really important that the two work together to help a child and help prevent future criminal behavior or future delinquent behavior. And as a whole, it will solve many problems that child will face later in life. The next major hurdle and big struggle that comes with this study is how to integrate the knowledge that we've now shared into your classroom. First, behavioral journals. I mentioned this in the previous slide. This is a really good way of tracking a child's behavior and reactions to certain events or changes in their lives. If these behaviors are seen over and over and over again and are not adapting or not changing as they grow older, this is something that should be a red flag and should be stopped. Cooperative group effort between staff. In many schools, students see more than one staff member in a single day. So it is very important that teachers work together. They talk about any alarming behaviors that they see in a child, and they kind of map out how a child acts on a given day. Mentor groups for teachers. In some situations, younger teachers have a harder time noticing the behaviors seen in children that are alarming or keeping track of them with a new job and start learning the ropes of how to be a teacher. It's important that older teachers or teachers that are more um, veteran to the newer teachers in their first couple of years help show them the ropes and point out different behaviors that should be considered alarming. Finally, we come to the conclusion and short wrap up of this presentation. Specific behaviors can lead to specific crimes in children. It's not just a handful of ideas or a handful of behaviors that end up leading to a broad criminal behavior. There are behaviors that specifically lead to other behaviors, and this means, at least in the psychology and criminology world, that there are direct ways to help respond and react to these behaviors. Making an effort as a group is far more powerful than an individual to report behavior. Just like anything in the professional world, when a group can come together and use evidence against something, it is much more powerful than a single individual doing it. Teachers do not feel empowered to make a difference. It's very tough for the teachers to make a difference, to want to reach out, to help these children make a change when it does not go beyond them, and that is a very important change that needs to happen. This concludes the presentation on child behavior and how teachers can help reduce crime. Here's a look at my references for this presentation and this survey. And when you please have the time, please take the post-test survey, and so that we may better understand how this presentation has helped educate you on behaviors that may lead to criminal behaviors later in life.